Calvin are the best known examples of Reformed leaders. And the Catholic Church had a horrible pushback against these rebels, as they saw them, called the Counter-Reformation or the Catholic Reformation, which featured the Holy Inquisition. It featured a lot of abuse against Protestant heretics, as they were known. However, Luther and Calvin were endorsed by the local governments and protected by the local governments that they formed alliances with on and off throughout their lifetimes as faith leaders. But because they were endorsed by governments and they made up church institutions to protect their followers and protect their own work, they were known as the Magisterial Reformation, which essentially meant doctrine coming from a semi-centralized authority, like the Pope in Rome. But when all of these other Reformed or Reformation groups started, each territory in Europe, depending on where they were, could basically pick their pope. If a prince or some government had a protection or an agreement with Lutherans or Calvinists, depending on those sympathies of those rulers of the land, that is the unofficial pope that they picked. And of course, in the great domains of the Catholic Church, like Spain, Portugal, and Italy, the pope in Rome was always the pope. But then there was a group. If we have Catholics, magisterial reformers like Luther or Calvin, there was a third way, a branch known as the Radical Reformation that many of us have seen in North America. Most of us can think of the Amish or conservative Mennonites who dress plainly and live simple lives. That's their main aim. Let's talk about the origins of the Mennonite or Anabaptist groups as they were known. The best known group of Anabaptists, which means, by the way, rebaptizers. Ana in Greek means again, so to baptize again is what they were known for. They were insulted. They were called rebels. They had to put up with a lot of persecution historically. They suffered a lot. But we'll take a look at the life of the man after whom the most famous group was named, the Mennonites. They were named after Menno Simons, a gentle guy, gentle presence, former parish priest in the Netherlands, in the northern area, in the northern province of Friesland. He was a Catholic clergyman who led an uneventful life of a priest. The highlights of his week were playing cards with the locals, doing the mass, but he underwent a 9-year spiritual crisis while remaining silent and while serving his community as a parish priest as faithfully as he could. Nonetheless, during his silence, in 1525, a really atrocious conflict broke out in Europe called the Peasants' War. Essentially, Anabaptists were harassed and stigmatized and treated very with a lot of cruelty based on their convictions to not pledge allegiance, to not say oaths, to get baptized again, but also due to the stigma of the Peasants' War. They were seen as rebellious and even violent. So after his spiritual crisis, Menno Simons broke away from the church and became an itinerant preacher. There were loose groups from Holland and Switzerland that we don't really have a whole lot of information on. The first believers' baptism that took place from within an Anabaptist movement that were known later on as the Swiss Brethren was in 1525 also, in this whole period of the Peasants' War. The first baptized believer was George Blaurock, baptized by Conrad Grebel on January 21st, 1525 in Zurich, Switzerland. So forever after, we will see the Anabaptist branches essentially two of them, the Swiss Anabaptists and the Dutch Anabaptists. The Swiss Anabaptists were historically known as Swiss Brethren. The Dutch Anabaptists would later on take the name Mennonite. After the first adult convert, after George Blaurock was baptized by Conrad Grebel, the Swiss Brethren started to mushroom all over Zurich. And 2 years later, they assembled in a little Swiss town called Schleitheim. The leader who put that group together was Michael Sadler. Michael Sadler had been a Benedictine monk who renounced the life in the monastery and started a family. And he was martyred in 1527 at the age of 37. He was charged with defying the emperor, rejecting the presence of Christ in the Eucharist, and infant baptism. He also rejected extreme unction. He was accused of dishonoring the saints because of the disavowal of saints and virgins' intercessions. He advocated non-resistance, and he got married. So he renounced his monastic vows. And he was burned to powder. So he assembled this group under a document with 7 points containing the main teachings of the Anabaptists. The document that was drafted was known by the name of the Schleitheim Confession because of the town where they gathered. In that document, some of the 7 key points included a refusal to take oaths, a refusal to participate in wars, a rejection of infant baptism, and a profession of faith in Christ before making the decision to be baptized, and thereby refusing to partake in loyalty to earthly authorities, earthly governments. His life had a very sad ending, obviously, but it was just the beginning of a seed that would continue to grow and spread like wildfire. That was the Anabaptist group all over Europe. After Sadler's death, the Anabaptists continued to grow. It is widely attributed to one of the fathers of the church, Justin Martyr, the quote that says, the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. That was very much the story, the case for the Anabaptist movement. The Peasants' War had a number of Anabaptists in it. It wasn't directly an Anabaptist-led movement, but it served as enough of an excuse for the magisterial reformers, namely Lutherans, Calvinists, and Catholics, to give Anabaptists a bad name. While all of this was going on, Menno Simons had his internal turmoil and the 9-year-long spiritual crisis. Menno Simons finally comes into contact with the Anabaptists in 1531, so 6 years after the first believer's baptism under George Blaurock and Conrad Grebel, the Swiss Brethren. He came into contact in 1531, and he had a gradual process of the winding down of his crisis, because in 1534, he rejected the violence of the Munster Rebellion, which was an extreme apocalyptic sect taking control of the region of Munster, with naked guys running around claiming to be David, claiming to receive special revelations about the end times. It was a tragedy. It was a tragedy that so many of them died, obviously as martyrs, but it was a tragedy in the sense that it reinforced the perception of the Anabaptists as up to no good, as people who were out to corrupt the gospel, out to be deviant rebels. So 2 years later, after the spiritual crisis continued, namely the spiritual crisis being his wrestling with Christ's presence in the Eucharist, Christ's presence in the elements of the Lord's Supper and infant baptism, he rejected, finally 2 years later, the priesthood in 1536. So he had a long journey, and evidently he was doing more productive things than just playing cards with the locals. And 1 year later, in 1537, he was ordained by Obe Phillips and got married, and thereby starting this chapter by which he became a prominent figure in the Anabaptist movement. Obe had been the leader of the Dutch members of the Anabaptist group, And in fact, Oba and his brother Dirk were some of the founding members of this community. Oba, for different reasons, had different disagreements and fell away. So the followers took the name of the main leader at the time, who was Menno. Menno took over Oba as the main leader. Otherwise, the Dutch Anabaptists would probably still be known, and their descendants obviously would still be known as Obanites. Mennonites, perhaps because we've heard it for almost 500 years, has a catchier and a better ring to it than Obanites. But those were the early beginnings of Anabaptism, weathering the horrible storms of the religious wars, rebellions, like the Peasants' War, like the Munster Rebellion, the Inquisition cracking down on them, the magisterial Reformation movements like Lutherans and Calvinists also cracking down and attacking the Anabaptists as violent rebels. That is the founding period of the Anabaptist movement. So after Oba Philips ordained Menno in 1537, Menno becomes the main leader of the Dutch Anabaptist movement. In fact, 7 years later, in 1544, the first correspondence that we have a record of names the followers of the Dutch strand of Anabaptism as Mennonites instead of Obanites. So after Oba falls away and leaves the movement due to some disagreements, it's not entirely certain why and what those disagreements are, or if he ever came around. Some sources say that he very possibly did come around. But Menno led as a married man. He had children, but he had to raise them, and basically as a rambling man, moving from place to place, because as Mennonites refused, or Anabaptists in general refused to pledge oaths, refused to conform to the image of governments as far as what they would like Christians to be. He led in exile, essentially several exiles that he had to flee as he and his followers faced persecution for 25 years until his death in 1561.